Hey, what's going on guys? Welcome back to another video. Today I'll be going over Tailwind CSS. I'll explain what it is, how to get started with it, and then show you some cool features that it has. I'll cover some common utility classes, responsive design, dark mode, animations, customizing the theme, and more. So without further ado, let's get started. First, let's go over what Tailwind is. It's a CSS framework that gives us a bunch of utility classes that we can use to style our components. Each utility class has an associated set of CSS that gets applied. For example, the flex class sets your component's display to flex. The PT4 applies a padding top of 4 units. The text center just applies text aligned center. So we could take a bunch of utility classes and chain them to style our component. Tailwind also gives us utility classes to help style hover and focus states, add responsive styles, and dark mode. If we scroll down to this example, we could see how it works in action. As different utility classes are being applied, it's changing how this card on the left looks. We can add as many different classes we want to each component, and all those styles will apply. So when it comes to learning Tailwind, all we really have to know is which utility class we need to use to apply the styles that we want. If we keep scrolling down, we'll see some common utility classes. To set the width of an element, we could just pass W-96 or W-60, depending on what size we want. And here's what the different sizes look like. Tailwind also comes with a bunch of theme colors. To use one of their colors on a background, all we have to pass is BG, then the color name, and then the shade. And we get access to a bunch of different shades. We can also add our own custom colors and extend the theme. If we look at the typography, we can see that Tailwind comes with 3 fonts out of the box. It's the sans, serif, and mono fonts. To use the font in a component, you would pass the class font and then the name, so font sans or font serif. When you add a custom font, it'll automatically generate a class name for it, which we'll see later in the video. Here are some cool examples of what you can build with Tailwind. There are a few different cards that they display, and they give you the source code on the right. So if you like any of the designs, you could copy this whole chunk of code and paste it into your app. It'll look exactly the same as it looks in here because they are using the same utility classes that you will have access to. Now you might be worried that using Tailwind will bloat your CSS bundle. However, we don't have to worry about that because Tailwind automatically removes any unused CSS when it builds for production. So when we're developing, we have access to all the class names that they provide, but when it builds our output CSS file, it'll scan our entire app and look at all the class names that we use and only add those to the output bundle. Here's a visual of how that looks. So as we add class names, they get added to our build.css file. And if we remove classes from our components, they would be removed from this build. So in the end, we're left with one CSS file, and it only has the class names that we use from Tailwind. So we never have to worry about a bloated bundle. We keep going down, we could see how responsive design works in Tailwind. The default Tailwind theme has a set of breakpoints. We could see those on the docs. There is small, medium, large, extra large, and double XL. And each breakpoint has an associated width. So the small breakpoint would apply when the browser width is 640 pixels to 767. The medium breakpoint would apply at 768 and go to 1023, and so on. To apply styles at different breakpoints, we just need to pass the breakpoint in the class. For example, by default, the image will have a width of 16 units. Then on the medium breakpoint, it'll go to 32, and on the large, it'll go to 48. So as the screen increases, we could apply different styles. We could see that back in the example. If I scroll down to see the code, watch the classes when I increase the width. So once I go to the small breakpoint here, you'll see that this utility class gets applied. And this padding overrides the default padding set on the element. Once we go to the medium breakpoint, these classes get applied and override the small and default classes. So for each style that we want to change as the screen increases, we just have to prefix it with the breakpoint name, and it makes it really easy to make responsive styles. We keep going down, we'll see how to apply hover and focus states. To do that, we just need to use the hover and focus keywords. For example, let's take a look at this button. When we hover over it, you'll see that there's this class that gets highlighted. bgblue400. It's prefixed with the hover keyword, which tells Tailwind to only apply this class when the element is being hovered. If we scroll over, we'll see that the element has a background of blue 500, which is what we currently see. And then when we hover over it, it'll get the background blue 400. The focus state works in a similar way, where this input, once it's focused, gets applied these styles. So it changes the focus ring color. Tailwind also has a concept of groups. Groups allow us to style child components based on the state of a parent. For example, in this div here, when we hover over it, you'll see that the icon and this text changes color. We can accomplish that by using the group hover class. In here, on the SVG, there's a group hover class defined, and that's set to text blue 500. So when its group or its parent is hovered, it'll apply that class. All we have to do to get it to work is to apply the group on the parent. So this parent anchor tag should have a class of group, and here it is. So now within the child, we could just apply group hover and add a class to it. If we keep going down, we'll see some more examples of different cards and components we can make. Here's an example of how we can add custom styles. So we could go into the root CSS file and add our own class names and then apply different styles to those class names. If we want to use the Tailwind utility class, we have to prefix all the class names with the @apply directive. If we want to just use plain old CSS, we could do that as well. Once we've created our own custom class names, we could pass them in just like a normal Tailwind utility class. Now let's look at how dark mode works. To apply styles when dark mode is enabled, we have to prefix each utility class with the dark variant. For example, let's take a look at this music player. By default, it has a background of white. When I turn dark mode on, you'll see that it changes the background color, and we can see the overwritten background class. It's prefixed with dark, and then the background utility class that should be applied when dark mode is enabled. Each style that you want to apply when dark mode is enabled, you have to prefix with the dark keyword. So this makes it really easy to apply light and dark mode styles because you could just have the light mode class and right next to it specify the dark variant. I'll show you how to set this up in your app later in the video. If you want to extend the default Tailwind theme, like adding a custom font or your own color scheme, or maybe even adding a new breakpoint, you could do that by updating the tailwind.config.js. That's basically just a configuration file that allows you to extend Tailwind and add extra functionality to it. For example, in the config file, there's a theme property, and if you want to add your own custom colors, you just pass a colors object, and each key in this object will be its own color. When you define your own set of colors, Tailwind will automatically generate utility classes for the colors you defined. For example, it'll generate a class like text-primary-50 and text-secondary-300, and you could call these whatever you want. Here's some examples of how you can easily lay out a set of components. To display a grid, we pass the grid class, set the grid rows to 2 and the grid columns to 3, and also give it a gap. That's all we need to make the layout look like this. We can also apply different transforms through the utility classes. First, we pass a transform class and then the transform we want. So if we want to scale it to be bigger, we would do scale-110. To rotate it, we would pass rotate 6. This dash means that it'll be a negative value. So if we rotate the element 6 units, the actual value will be negative. You can also apply transforms like translate Y and a bunch of other ones. We can also apply different filters like blur, saturate, grayscale, and more. When you develop with Tailwind, I highly recommend you get the Tailwind extension. The extension gives you linting and some really great autocomplete. If you have conflicting classes applied, like display flex and display block, the extension will point that out to you. Additionally, it gives you a really nice autocomplete, where you can just type the beginning of a class name and it shows you all the available options. Lastly, there's lots of different websites that give you pre-built Tailwind components. For example, if we go to Tailwind UI, we'll see a bunch of different Tailwind components that we can just copy and paste into our app. We scroll down and say we want a call to action. It gives us the preview, and we could select the code here and just copy all of this and paste it into our app. So you could build out your UI or landing page really fast by just copy and pasting a bunch of already built components. A lot of the components on this website are not free, so I would recommend using other sites for that, but some of the components are free. Now let's set up Tailwind with React and build a few components. Let's go back up to the top and click the Get Started button. Then we'll select Framework Guides and click V. Then let's open up a terminal and paste this first command in. This will create a V project, and I'm going to rename it to be Tailwind. So I'll do tailwind-app, and the template will be React. So we'll hit enter, then let's cd into that directory. And now we need to install the dev dependencies. So we'll install Tailwind and its peer dependencies. Paste that in. Once those are installed, we need to run this npx tailwind css init command. And essentially all that's going to do is create the Tailwind config file and the post CSS config file. Once we've run that, we can open this up in VS Code. The next step is to add this content block to our Tailwind config file. So let's copy that over and open up the tailwind.config.js, and we'll replace that content there. The content property just tells Tailwind which files it needs to scan in order to generate our output CSS file. So we're telling it to look at the index.html file. So any classes that we add in this file, it'll add them to the output CSS file. And then we're telling it to look through our source directory with any file extension of JS, TS, JSX, and TSX. So that will cover our entire app. Let's save that and go back to the next step. The next thing we need to do is add these Tailwind directives in the index.css file. The index.css will be our root CSS file, and we won't need any others. So let's just delete app.css. Let's also remove the app.css from the import, and with that, we should be able to start our server. So open up a terminal and run npm run dev. That'll spin up a local development server. If you click on the URL here, we'll see our homepage. Let's remove all of the starter code except for the V logo. Then let's add our app container. So that'll be a div, and we'll give it a few class names. Give it a dark background, set the min height to 100 VH, and center the content. Let's also shrink the size of this browser so we can see the preview on the left. And now I want to show you how easy it is to apply animations in Tailwind. All we have to do is pass the animate class, and if you hit Control Space, you'll see all the options we have. So there's animate spin, which will just spin our logo. There's the ping animation, which gives it a pinging effect. There's a pulse animation. And lastly, there's a bounce animation. So it's just as simple as adding the class name to your component, and it automatically animates. Let's comment this out for now and build a div for all of our content. So we'll go right below it and add some class names to the div. I'll give it a padding top of 36 units and also set a max width. This time, however, I want to pass a custom value. To do that, you open up square brackets, and inside you could give it whatever you want. So I'll say 1000 pixels. Let's save that and start working on our card. For the card component, I'm going to go to a website called tailwindcomponents.com. And in the search bar, type in Tailwind CSS project card. And it'll be the first option that comes up. Here's a website similar to Tailwind UI where there's a bunch of pre-built Tailwind components that we have access to. So I like this card, and I could just click show code and copy all the code. Let's close out of that, and in our app, we'll create a components folder. And inside that, create a file called projectcard.jsx. We'll just paste all of that in, remove this bottom div and hit save, and also remove this comment at the top. Let's get rid of this absolute class and change this SVG props. So instead of fill rule, we want to change it to be camel case. Let's also change clip rule to be camel case. Now we should be able to use this product card in our app. Let's copy the name and paste it in here. And if we save, we should see that card exactly how it looked in the example. I also have to change the class prop to be class name since we're in React. So I'll select all of those by doing Command D and then just adding name. So now it should have no errors in the console and we're good. The first thing I want to add is dark mode. If we look at the finished files, we'll see that when we toggle the dark and light mode, the card actually changes colors, and so does the background. In our current app, our background is hard-coded, and so is our card. Let's begin by adding a dark variant to the card background. In the project card component, we should see a class name called bg-white. So right next to it, let's create a new class, and we'll say dark, and give it a darker color, like BG Slate 800. So now if we save, we'll see that dark color is applied. The reason this works is because Tailwind by default will use the user's system preferences to determine whether to use the dark mode variant or the light mode style. So if I change my system preferences to be light mode, then we'll see that the card actually goes back to being white. If we want to let the user toggle between light and dark mode, then we have to update the Tailwind config file. Let's open that up. And right above content, let's add a new property called dark mode. And this could be one of two values, either class or media. Media will just use whatever the user prefers and will not allow them to toggle it back and forth. With the class option, Tailwind will look for the nearest parent component with a dark class, and if that exists, it'll use the dark variant, otherwise it'll use the light. So if we set this to class, then you'll see that our card goes back to being white. To toggle dark mode, we have to go to our index.html, and on the HTML tag, let's add a class name to it and call it dark. Once we hit save, we'll see that the dark styles are being applied. So all we really need to do is toggle this class on the parent HTML element. Then Tailwind will know which classes it needs to apply based on whether the dark class exists. Under the source directory, let's create a new file called useDarkMode. I created this hook earlier, so I'm just going to paste it in and run through it real quick. When we call useDarkMode, it's going to create a piece of state called enabled. To get the initial state, I'm going to check local storage, and if there's a value of local storage, I'm going to use that. If there's no value, then I'll just default it to whatever the user prefers. Then I'm running a useEffect, which will get the root document, set the current value of the enabled state to local storage, and then check if enabled is true. I'm going to add the dark class to the HTML element, otherwise I'm going to remove it. Then anytime the enabled state changes, I'm going to update the local storage and either add or remove the dark class. I also created a toggle function, which will toggle the enabled state back and forth. And then I'm returning the dark mode enabled state and the toggle function. Now let's create a nav component that will display our toggle buttons. We'll call it nav.jsx, and inside the div, we'll just put toggle dark mode for now. And then let's call the hook we just made. So we'll do use dark mode, and that's going to return an array. We'll get the first piece of state and we'll call it dark mode enabled. And that's going to be a Boolean. And then the second parameter is the toggle function. Let's pass the toggle function to this div so we could toggle it once we click on it. And now let's import the nav in our app. Right above the project card, we'll import that in and save. Now when we click, we should be able to toggle light and dark mode. And if we inspect element and go to our elements here, you'll see that when dark mode is on, the class gets applied, and when we remove it, it gets removed. It's also persisted to local storage. So if you click on the local storage tab, you'll see dark mode is true, and it'll toggle between true and false. So all of that logic is working. Now we just need to build out these icons. Go back to our nav component. And under components, I'm going to paste in two icons, which are just SVGs of the moon and sun. Back in our nav component, let's remove the onClick and let's add a few class names. We want to add the flex class and specify justify end so it pushes the content to the right. And then we'll give it a margin bottom of 8. Let's remove this text and instead output a button. We'll add the toggle function to the button's onClick, and then we'll give it a few class names. For now, let's just do text gray 300. Inside the button, we need to display either the sun or moon icon. So let's check is dark mode enabled? If it is, we'll display the sun icon. Otherwise, we'll display the moon icon. Now if we save, we should have the toggle working. And there we go. Now let's add dark mode styles for the rest of the elements, because it still looks pretty ugly. I'm going to shrink down the browser size so we could see it as we're editing. Now let's open up the project card. The element that has material Tailwind, let's go to the class names and remove its text class. Instead, we're going to set the text color on its parent card, and that'll be reflected in its children. On the parent card component, let's also remove this text blue-gray. And at the top, let's say the default style will be text-dark. So on white mode, the text will be dark. And now let's specify the dark variant. So we'll do dark and set the text to white, the text-white. Now if we save, we should see that that text is white. The next step is to make this text a little bit brighter when it's in dark mode. Let's scroll down to the description here. And currently it's set to text gray 700. So we'll leave that as the default. And then let's add a dark variant. So we'll do dark : and set it to 500 so it's a little bit lighter. Now if we save, it should look a bit nicer. Lastly, let's change the text color of these three elements here. We'll copy these two text styles because it's going to be the same for those items. And let's delete the current text styles. So each item here has this text gray 700. So I'm just going to take that and multi-select those and just remove them from the element. And then I'm just going to apply the text classes to its parent, which is here. I'll paste in the same values and also remove this text class. And once we save, the color should match whatever the description is. When we go back to light mode, these will be darker. So that looks good. Now let's change this page background so that on light mode, it's not dark blue. Let's navigate to the app component and let's prefix the current background with dark because that's what we want for dark mode. But the light mode style will just be BG-white. So now we get a lighter background. Let's also change this icon to be a bit darker in light mode. So in the nav bar, right now it's set to text gray 300, but we only want this to apply if it's in dark mode. So we'll prefix it with dark and add the light version right before it. We'll set that to text gray 900. Now that should be a little bit darker in light mode. Next, let's change this pill to be pink and change the hover color on this title. In the project card, let's find the current color and it's BG purple 500. So I'm just going to change that to BG pink 400. Then on the title, in its hover effect, I'm also going to change it to the same color, text pink 400. So now that pill is pink and the hover effect matches that color. The last thing we need to do is animate the colors. So right now, when the dark mode is toggled, it just instantly updates the background colors and it doesn't look that smooth. If you look at the finished project, the background animates and I think it looks a lot nicer. To accomplish this, we just need to set a transition class on the elements whose background changes. So in our app, the background is changing here. So let's just add a transition class to it. And then we'll specify the colors because we want to transition the colors, which would include the background color. Then we'll give it a duration of 300 milliseconds. So now the background should animate, but our card also needs to have that transition. So let's copy these two classes and add them to our project card. We'll just tack it on at the end, and now both of these should transition smoothly. Let's get rid of this ugly white border. We'll search for the border class and just remove that out of there. I think that looks much nicer. And let's actually remove the transition from this title. So under Material Tailwind, let's remove that transition colors. There we go. The next thing I want to do is make a responsive container for these cards, because in a real-world app, we'd probably have multiple cards, and we'd want them to rearrange based on the screen size. So back up in our app, let's just create 2 more cards, and we'll wrap them in a grid container. So let's create a div and move those cards into that div. Then we'll add a few class names. We'll add the grid class, and we'll set the grid columns. So we'll do grid calls 1 to say that it takes up 1 column, and then we'll give it a gap of 4. So right now, nothing should change because we've only specified 1 column. But if we increase the screen size, it should go to 2 columns and then to 3. To do that, we just need to specify the breakpoint in the class and apply the new column value. So right after this class name, let's add a small breakpoint and set the grid columns to 2. And then we'll add a medium and set them to 3. So now if we save, we should see the columns rearrange as the screen size increases. We actually probably want to set this to large instead of medium. And there we go. So now they're rearranging smoothly, and it looks nice on all screen sizes. Now, what if I wanted to reuse this card in other parts of my app? Maybe not this content inside, but just this rounded div with the box shadow and the font size and the changing background color based on the theme. Right now, I would have to go back into my code, take this div, and copy that into every place I need it. Instead, I should be able to take these base styles that would be the same across all the cards, like the text color, the rounded corners, the shadow, and the transition, extract that away into a card component, and then just pass it a card class like this. Then we could get rid of all of these class names and only add extra classes if we need to. We can accomplish that using layers. If we look at our index.css file, we'll see that there are 3 layers that are defined. And these layers just refer to a different bucket of styles. If we open up the Tailwind docs on layers, we'll see that a layer is just a place that we could define custom styles. For example, the base layer just deals with the base HTML elements, like your H1 or H2. We can apply certain styles to every single H1 element and every H2. In the components layer, we could create class names for certain reusable components within our app, like a button or a card. Then in our components, we would just pass a class name called button blue, and all of these styles would be applied. The last layer is utilities. In this layer, you would just add your own custom utility classes that don't exist in Tailwind. For example, we could add a center class that just combines display flex, justify content center, and align item center. Those 3 classes would comprise the one, and then I could just pass center to any component, and it would center the content. So let's update our index.css to add our card component. We'll start off by doing @layer, and then specify the components layer. Then we'll add a class called card. In here, we need to start with the @apply directive because we're going to use Tailwind utility classes. And then let's go back to our project card and remove all the styles that are specific to a base card. So we'll take the text classes, remove those out of there. And then let's grab all of these other styles that deal with the font, the padding, the shadow, and let's also grab the transitions. So we'll remove those out of there and paste it into our index file. I just realized we had text dark. That should be text black. Now we should be able to save this, then save our card component, and nothing should change in our app. So our cards still look the same, and they still all work on dark mode. But now I could go back into our app and add a new div, add some dummy text in it, and then give it a class name of card, and we should see our card component. And it now has light and dark mode, the same rounded corners, and the font. Next, let's add our own utility function to center the content of any element. We'll open up the index.css and add a new layer. We'll specify the layer as utilities. Then we'll specify a class name called center. Then we'll use the apply directive and specify flex, justify center, and item center. Now let's take this center class and use it in our div. So right next to card, let's also pass center, and we should see that content is centered. Now let's wrap this text in an H3 and add a base layer to style it. So let's create an H3 element and paste that in there. Then let's go back to our index.css and add a new layer. We'll specify the base layer, and then we want to target the H3 element. We'll add the apply directive, and we'll set the font to mono. We'll make it semi-bold, and then we'll give it a color of sky. Now if we save, we should see all those are applied to our H3 without having to pass any classes to it. So that's it for layers. Now let's talk about extending the Tailwind theme. Sometimes the base default theme isn't enough for your app. Maybe you need your own custom brand colors, a new font, or a custom set of breakpoint values. To extend or override the Tailwind theme, we need to update the Tailwind config file. So let's open that up, and you'll see that there's a theme property. To add to the theme, we just need to add new properties under this object. Let's start by adding a custom color. To do that, we need to pass a colors property, and that's equal to an object. Inside, we specify our color name as the key. So I'll create an error color, and for the value, it can either be a hex code value as a string, or if you want to be more granular, it can be an object where each key is the specified shade or variant of the color. Let's start by adding a default color. So we'll specify that in all caps and just paste in a hex code. Then we'll define a lighter color of that error, which will be another hex code. And then we'll also add a dark version. Once we hit save, you'll see that our app actually crashes. If we look at the error message, it says text sky 300 does not exist. The reason we're getting this error is because when we pass this colors object to the top level theme, it overrode all of the default theme colors. So we've essentially replaced all of the Tailwind colors with our one color. If you wanted to override the entire color palette, then it's fine to keep it at the top level theme object. But if we just want to add on to the colors, then we should move this block of code to live inside the extend property. So the extend property will only add on to the theme and not override any existing values. So now if we save, our app should go back to normal. I would only add properties to the top level theme if you want to override every single value in the theme, like maybe all the breakpoints. Now that we've added these colors, Tailwind generated utility classes for each of these variants. Let's go back to our app and try to use one of these colors. In our H3, I'll add a class name and type text-error because that was our class name. And if I hit Control Space, we should see the auto suggestions. Here's our default color and then the light and dark versions. Let's select the light version, and if we hit save, you'll see that that gets reflected. It's pretty convenient that Tailwind automatically generates these classes for each variant that we've defined. Now let's extend another property like the border radius. If we look at the docs for border radius, we'll see that the sizes only go up to 3XL, which is 1.5 rem, and then it'll go to rounded full. So let's add another variant of rounded 4XL and maybe set it to 2 rem. Let's go back to the Tailwind config file, and right below the colors, we'll add a border radius property, set that to an object, and for the key, we want to specify our new size. So we'll type 4XL and then the value for it. So we'll put 2 rem. Now if we save and go back to our card, let's type rounded, and we should see this new size. And there it is, 4XL. So if we apply that, our border radius should change on our card, and there it is. Now let's add a custom font. To begin, let's select a font we want to add. So I'll go to Google Fonts, then look up the font Montserrat. Then I'll select a few styles like regular 400 and maybe the bold 700. Once we've selected those, we could go to this little bag icon, and then we'll just copy this link tag. Now we need to add that to our index HTML. In our head tag, we'll just paste that in right above our title. And let's save and go back to our Tailwind config file. Below the border radius property, let's add a new property called font family. This is going to be an object, and the key will be the name of our custom font. So I'll just say Montserrat. And for the value, we need to pass an array. And if we go back to Google Fonts, let's just copy this CSS rule and paste that in. Now that we've added this font to our theme, Tailwind will generate a utility class called font-montserrat, and it'll be equal to this value. Let's go back to our project card and change the font of it. Let's go down to the description here, and instead of font sans, let's add our custom font. So there it is in the auto suggestions, and once we hit save, we should see that reflected in our card, and the description is changed. To verify, we could open up the inspector and search the font class, and we'll see that it's applied there. Now let's start working on this input. When it's focused, you'll see that the color of the label changes, and that's accomplished through peers. I'm also going to remove some of these extra cards, so we'll just go back to this one. I'll comment this out for now, and then just add one project card. Now I'm going to go back to tailwindcomponents.com. And in the search bar, I'm going to look up group, label, and input. Then we're just going to select the first option here. And then let's just click the copy icon to copy all the code. Then we'll go back in our app, and under the components directory, we'll add a new file called input.jsx. And let's just paste in all that code. We'll remove these two comments and change the class prop to be class name. Now let's save this and bring the input into our app. And we don't actually need this background, so let's go ahead and remove that. Now we're left with just the input. Let's also give it some margin top. So we'll say MT-8, and that spaces it out better. The way that this color effect is accomplished is through using peers. If we look at the code, we'll see that this input consists of an input element and a label, and they're sibling elements. So if we set the peer class on the input, then within the label, we could target states like peer focus, which will apply the style we set when its peer is focused. So when our input is focused, it'll apply a border class and this background class. And that's all we need to do to style its sibling when the input is focused. We can also target states like hover, active, open, and a bunch of other ones. Similar to peers, we can use groups if we want to target a child element instead of a sibling. So on the parent, we would add a group class, and then any children can have a class like group-hover, and then apply a style when its parent is hovered. Now let's add some dark mode styles to make the input look a bit nicer. In the label, where we have the background slate, let's add a dark variant, and we'll just set that to BG transparent. Then let's copy these two background styles and apply them to our input. Right next to peer, I'll just paste those in. Now it looks a bit better. And lastly, let's change the color of this text so that it's white in dark mode. In our input, we'll see that the text is currently set to Slate 900, and right next to it, we'll just add a dark variant and set it to text-white. So now we'll be able to see it better in dark mode. Let's also change the color of this placeholder text to be a little bit darker. On the input, you'll see that there's a placeholder slate class, and that sets the color of the placeholder text. So right next to it, we'll just add a dark variant and target placeholder. And we'll set it to Slate-700. Now if we save, the placeholder is a bit darker, and when we type, the text is white. And this works well on dark mode as well. The last thing I want to talk about is dynamic class names. Sometimes our components need to use dynamic class names based on props or state, like an error state in the component or a background color that was passed in through props. The Tailwind docs give us some guidance on how to do that. We can see here that Tailwind only extracts the class name to your output CSS file if they're complete unbroken strings. So this example down here would not work because they have the beginning of the class name and then a ternary here, which would output one of these strings, and then the remaining class name. This isn't valid because it isn't a complete string. The better way to do this would be by specifying the full class name. It's still okay to do the ternary as long as you define the entire class name, so Tailwind will know that it needs to generate these two classes. Additionally, we shouldn't use props to build out class names. This would still be an incomplete string, And Tailwind doesn't know the value of this color prop at compile time, so it's not going to know which classes it needs to generate. Instead, you should create a variance map in your component, which has all the dynamic class names you would need under certain cases. Like if the user passed in blue or red, it would use these values. When Tailwind looks at this code at compile time, it'll know to look at the color variance object here and generate classes for all the potential values that could be returned. So this would be completely valid. So you just need to make sure that you statically define all the possible values so Tailwind will know to generate those classes in the output CSS file. That's it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed and subscribe if you haven't already. It would help me out a ton. Let me know in the comments if you have any feedback or what you guys want to see next, and I'll see you in the next one.